Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Her undergraduation at Women's Christian College and her master's in physics in IITM, and also did her PhD at IITM. She did her thesis under the supervision of Professor Lakshmi Bala. Right now, she's a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Warwick. Her current body of work is in the interface of gravity and quantum physics. The topic for today is gravitational waves. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you for a very kind introduction, and good morning. Good morning. We're going to talk about gravitational waves. Okay, I've said gravitational waves and beyond, but let's keep the beyond on the back burner now because I don't know how much time we'll have. So, before we start off and explain what a gravitational wave is and everything, I wanted to give you a carrot. Just like when you're going on a chase, it's always sweeter to start with a carrot, knowing what you will get in the end. So, this is what a postdoctoral researcher, somebody like me, sitting in Italy, Padua, Italy, saw one morning. He was actually on a conference or something was working at that point in Hanover. Hanover is another place where there's a setup called GEO. This was a signal from the LIGO apparatus, which was based in the US. There were two apparatuses, two setups, one in Livingston, the other in Hanford. And the signal was from both Livingston and Hanford. I think the Livingston is blue, the Hanford is orange. This is what he saw on a very nice afternoon and decided that they have struck gold. Why did he think so is the rest of the story. So with that question and with that teaser, let me start. So let's start with something simple. There's a table. You have 2 points on the table. What's the distance between the 2 points? Can anyone tell me what's the distance between these 2 points, x1, y1 and x2, y2? Perfect. This is right, and this is called the Euclidean distance. This is as the crow flies between the 2 points. Now let us say you have a younger brother or somebody who comes and spills a whole lot of building blocks in between these 2 points. Or you're standing in a city block where there are a lot of buildings and you're not a crow, you have to walk. Then what's the distance between those 2 points? Sorry? 8 squares? 8 sides. That's a good way of counting, yeah. Or you can say that you can still keep x1, y1 and x2, y2 and say that's the absolute separation on the x-axis plus the absolute separation on the y-axis, which is the 8 sides. So, why did I make this argument? Because this is a heuristic argument to make you understand the geometry of a given surface makes a lot of difference in how you calculate distances. If the geometry changes, your definition for the distance can change. So what is so special about Euclidean distance? Why do you read it everywhere? Why do you use it to calculate distances everywhere? Shortest distance, yes. But is shortest the most convenient? Why do you say shortest is the most convenient? Or the most useful? Work done is least. Okay, that's one way of seeing it. If you have some work to do by going from point A to point B. A more physical way of understanding this is perhaps seeing that this is a distance that won't change if you move yourself from point A to point B through some translations. That is, I have a distance between 2 points, whether I'm standing here or standing elsewhere shouldn't change the distance between those 2 points. Whether I rotate myself in a certain specific manner, for example, in the geometry, if I go out of the plane, everything changes. If you're a crow, everything changes. If I rotate, I should not be I should not have to change the Distance, if I translate myself, I should not have to change the distance. This distance remains invariant under such motions. And hence, this is special. These are called Galilean transformations, and they are what sets the inertial frames of reference in a Newtonian world, where you say that, do you know what a frame of reference is? Do you know what inertial frame of reference is? Good. How many of you know it? Brilliant. So, in an inertial frame of okay, let me check. What's an inertial frame of reference? Not accelerated. Perfect. So, inertial frame of reference is something that is under uniform motion, and in the uniform motion, this distance is preserved. So, it is special. Now, let's back up. Okay. Now, these are just building up jigsaw puzzle pieces. They will fall into place and make a beautiful picture. Just come with me and get the pieces in your hand. I want to explain next what a metric is. So, a metric is, you just told me about the distance, which is given here in distance squared. So, ds squared is the distance squared basically. And this is the distance between the points A and B, right? In a three-dimensional space. Now, this vector VAB is the vector connecting these 2 points. Now, metric is a construct which connects this vector to this distance. Any guesses how it connects? Okay. In a Euclidean space, in a space where Euclidean distance makes sense, in a Euclidean space which is described by Cartesian coordinates, you can take these two vectors which are VAB basically, written as a row matrix and a column matrix. If you link it by this 3 by 3 identity matrix, you get the distance, distance squared. So, this identity matrix here is a metric of that particular space. So, this is just a mathematical construct. In this case, it doesn't even make sense. I can multiply and get it. Why are you bringing in this metric? A very unnecessary concept. It will make sense. Stay with me. I'll show why it makes sense. Things like these are completely useless when you pick up small, simple cases. But as you increase the abstraction, level of abstraction in your theory, it becomes crucial to have these constructs in hand. So, the first not normal thing that we do is add curvature to space. So, if you know inertial frames of reference, I bet you know spherical polar coordinates, or am I betting wrong? You don't know spherical polar coordinates. Okay, we'll explain that. That's not a big deal. So, you know that the coordinate system, you can say some point is at an x distance from along the x-axis, y distance along the y-axis, and z distance along the z-axis. Now, instead of doing it that way, you can describe a point through 3 other coordinates, r, theta, and phi, where r is the radial distance from the origin. Let's pick that corner to be our reference frame, and in that corner is the origin. A point here is radially separated by a certain distance that is given by r. Now, link these 2 points by a line, an imaginary line. See what angle it subtends with the z-axis which is going up. That is theta. And now there is a plane you can form between that line and the line which is connecting the origin and this. So that surface is actually marked there in the figure, but it's easier if you want to do it in your head. There's a plane here. So there is a particular phi angle that is subtended from the x-axis. So let me be closer. If you are here, there is a certain angle which you subtend with this, and that angle is phi, and the angle which subtends with that corner, the z-axis, is theta, and the radial distance r. This completely marks the point, just like x, y, z. Now, what is the infinitesimal distance that is along each of the different axes? Now, what are the different axes here? There is a radial vector which is pointing, up towards along the same direction, and along that it's going to be dr delta r, and theta is the angle from here to here. So you would expect it's just d theta, right? But see, if I have a point that is very close to the origin and I say an angle d theta or delta theta, and if I have a point far off, the same delta theta is going to take a longer distance as I get far off. So the infinitesimal distance is r d theta. It's not just d theta. Similarly for phi, it is not r d phi because r is along the radial vector. So you have to do r sine theta d phi. Is everybody following this? Do you need any clarifications? Okay. Did you get till r d theta? Okay. So there is an angle theta which is subtended with the z axis, and a delta theta is there, which subtends a smaller distance when it is closer to the origin. When it is farther away, it subtends a longer distance. So r is something which is affecting the distance subtended, right? So you do r d theta or r delta theta. Whereas for the phi, you have a delta phi. You want to say r d delta phi, right? But r is the angle along the radial line, whereas this is the angle on the bottom surface. There it will be r sine theta, which is the distance which is there along this axis for this point, because r is there, r cos theta is along that axis, r sine theta is on this plane, and r sine theta d phi gives you the delta phi, the infinitesimal distance along the phi axis. Phi axis is something that goes away from the x. Make sense? All this is mainly to say the metric here becomes dependent on r and theta, because now you have to include 1 from the dr part. This becomes r squared d theta squared, so this metric has an r squared, and r squared sine squared theta from r sine theta d phi. Yeah.
How do you measure that theta, like from the vector to the x-axis or from the axis to the vector?
From the axis to the vector.
But here we are doing it the opposite way, right? For phi, for psi.
For which?
For phi we are doing it the opposite way, right?
Why r sine theta is still on the plane, and delta phi you have not said any direction for it, right? Still fine. Okay. So basically the metric becomes dependent on r and theta, which are the coordinates of the system itself, which means the distance measured distance kind of becomes dependent on where you are on a curved surface, because you are now on a sphere which is about r, which is a radius r. So you are getting the signature of a sphere on the metric. Sorry. So when the metric becomes coordinate dependent, it's sign of curvature. So these are the places where metric plays a role. You can spot curvature, you can spot a distance dependence, coordinate dependence in measurement of distance. Why is that useful? We'll come to it. For that we need another tool, which is relativity. Yeah.
So what the dimensional form, so we don't, in gravitation, we don't refer to x, y, z.
No. This is nothing. I mean, this was just an example to show that curvature, what happens to a metric when there is a curved space. That was just an example. You can use Cartesian coordinates. In fact, we will use Cartesian coordinates. I just introduced that to say that if there is a manifold, if there is a surface that is curved, if I use manifold, it is because I am thinking of a higher dimension. It's basically surface in a higher dimension. We are on a curved surface. Yes. In r d theta phi, your origin was at the point in some sense. I mean, the origin is still there, but your coordinate directions will depend on which point you are. The origin is still O here, or the origin was still the corner there, but your r theta phi, the vectors which subtend your coordinate axes, their directions will depend on which point you have chosen. Yeah.
Is there any reason why we're not taking the angle for the y-axis?
It's not needed. But you don't need anything more to describe the point. You're done. When you say these three quantities, you have defined everything that it needs to be defined. If you can't locate the point, you need to give more details. For example, if somebody asks you the address to your home and they also live in Chennai, you're not going to say Chennai, Tamil Nadu, India, inside the earth. Not necessary, right? You will tell which place, street, locality, house number, because those are necessary to locate the place.
For any random curved surface, where can we assume our coordinate axis is placed?
That, see, this was I have a disclaimer here, mainly for that reason. This coordinate axis was chosen to introduce an artificial curvature so that I can tell you what happens in a metric when there is curvature. Otherwise, keep it simple, keep it Cartesian, and see if there is still signatures of curvature. Then there is actual curvature in your space.
Yeah, that's right.
Then you have something to think of, but that we'll come to a little later. There was another hand, yeah. Oh, two hands. My first hand.
Ma'am?
Go ahead. R squared sine square theta. Okay. There are three infinitesimal distances. You have to add up the squares of all three. This comes with just one. Here one. This comes with an r squared. This is r sine theta, so r squared sine square theta. Yeah.
My question was about the metric. So how do I understand the metric as such?
Here you don't need to understand this metric so well. I mean, here I am introducing all these fabulous terminology, which is probably a mistake because I was just trying to see what curvature you get. I was just trying to show you that metric, if they have a curvature, then you will get some coordinate dependent terms inside the metric.
So is it just to denote the coefficient of the particular changing distance?
Distance,
That's
yes,
all.
yes. How you define distance, if it changes, then your metric changes.
Ma'am, you had said that it's r instead of x, theta instead of y, and phi instead of z.
Okay, it's not exactly correspondingly different. It means that you're changing the way you're saying your address. See, if some in my days when I was a kid, when people said addresses, they always went house number, street locality, and city. Nowadays, you have something called Google codes. 6 letters define your address. You're not going to say, does the first letter in the Google code correspond to the house number? It's a code that has completely changed. It's not corresponding to each other. Okay. Going to relativity, which is another tool that you will need to understand gravitational waves. Okay, see, if you want to build something really nice, you need something foundationally strong. Relativity is built on two experimentally proven facts in some sense. It's an empirically known thing. It's experimentally known, people know it that way. So it's axiomatically introduced into the relativity. So this is a foundational principle which is not proven. What do they take for granted in relativity? They say that the laws of physics take the same form in all inertial frames of reference. And the other thing they say is that if there is interaction between two bodies, it does not happen instantaneously. The minimum amount of time it takes is the amount of time light takes to travel between those two bodies. That's the minimum amount of time. The corollary for this is that the speed of light, c, is something that's constant in all inertial frames. So, what does this cause? This means that we saw in Galilean transformations, we had translations and rotations. Now you add another transformation when you introduce relativity, that's called a Lorentz transformation. This slide, if you don't understand the math, don't worry about it. I just introduced this because I wanted to introduce this space-time distance. All I want to show here is that this Lorentz transformation is special because it elevates time to the same status of x. Time gets modified when you go from one reference frame to another in a manner which is on par, I won't say identical, on par with x, along which there is a Lorentz boost. X is the direction along which there is a Lorentz transformation. But time gets affected in similar ways to x. So this elevates time into the distance. So you get a space-time distance which is now described by a minus c squared dt squared plus dx squared plus dy squared plus dz squared. This distance is conserved under Lorentz boost. This is a homework. Go ahead, check if it is true. So this carries this Minkowski metric, which defines a flat space-time. Why do I call it space-time from now on? Because we gave an increment to this time and said, you can now sit with the space dimensions. And we are talking about a manifold that includes time. It is not your 3-dimensional or 2-dimensional surface. I know that the graphics is 2-dimensional. That's because they have left out y and z. They are thinking of t and x or t and y and t and z, something like that. They have left out 2 spatial dimensions. So this is not the space that you see. It is an abstract space. And in that abstract space, this defines a flat space-time, this metric. Now, special relativity is all about inertial frames and how space-time looks from that inertial frame. So that's all about flat space-time. When you go into general relativity, which is about non-inertial frames, accelerated frames, or frames that experience gravitational force, then the space-time becomes curved. In what sense? In the sense that we talked about, where these terms become coordinate dependent. Now get the connection why I introduced all that complicated spherical polar coordinates? This is the only reason. And what does it modify? All this time we saw that changes in metric modified the way distance was measured. So when the metric starts showing signs of curvature in this case, it's actual curvature. This is Cartesian coordinates in the 3 spatial dimensions. So the actual space is getting curved or getting distorted. And so the distance between actual physical bodies change when that happens. Space-time changes. So time changes, the space changes, everything changes. Space and time. So this is an interesting concept. And Einstein started this, and he also went ahead and proposed something called gravitational waves. What is gravitational waves? Imagine some powerful event happening, like a firecracker going off in air. You get shock waves, right? You hear a sudden puff of wind, you feel a sudden puff of wind, you hear a loud noise. All that is happening is because something is expanding somewhere, the mass is shifting there, and the air around it is being pushed out of that place, and you feel the effects. Similarly, the space-time manifold, when it's pushed around or when there's a huge change in mass distribution somewhere in space, which means something is accelerating, then you generate ripples in the manifold, and those are gravitational waves, which cause changes in the distance between objects. Okay, clear? So, this was predicted in 1916, detected in 2015. People were not sleeping around for 99 years. What happened is that these were extraordinarily tiny. These are so weak that it's really hard to predict it. I mean, really hard to see it, detect it. And these are, I mean, if you even want to think about detection, you want systems such as a binary star system like two neutron stars or two pulsars, two black holes colliding with each other. Neutron star density is something like this, 10 power 17 kilogram per meter cubed. So if you go to a neutron star and pick up, say, a teaspoonful of neutron star, it's going to weigh some hundreds of times the Giza pyramid. It's that heavy in a small teaspoonful. It's that dense. And those stars, when they go around each other in distances smaller than the distance between here and, I don't know, Tanjavur district, and collide with each other, you see a distance smaller than the fraction of a neutron size changing on Earth. So that is what you want to detect. And that is what was detected in 2015 with state-of-the-art machinery. So what did they see? This signal. That's why the postdoc sitting at Italy got so excited. And what did he hear when he made it into a sound? This. Does it go again? Is it? I have some. Just a minute. Did you hear the whoop? Whoop? That was the two neutron stars colliding. That small whoop. Okay, good. Okay, there's this YouTube link where you can go and see how exactly, there's an abstract form in which they have shown how the manifold kind of twists and turns. It's a 4-dimensional space but shown in a 2D video screen. Have fun. These slides are also available on a blogspot. I'll give the address in the end so you can get the whole works, including the audio file. So that happened in 2015. But between 1916 and 2015, people are not sitting and wasting time. What happened in 100 years? The first attempts in this direction were in 1969 itself, when Weber, Joseph Weber, you can see the man there, he built huge ultra pure aluminum cylinders, and he thought that because they are huge cylinders, when there's a gravitational wave, because it shakes by a very little amount, when you have that huge a cylinder, it will resonate with that gravitational wave and it will create a very small piezoelectric current. He wanted to detect that. It was a failed detection. I mean, he said that he detected something, it was never reproducible, so there was a lot of controversy. Go ahead and read it if you want to know how physicists fight. And there are still modern forms of Weber bars with where they have put it inside supercooled helium. They are trying to detect tiny magnetic fields, which with something called SQUID. It's a quantum interferometric device. Whatever. Go ahead and read that also. It's an experiment by Goryashev. I think this is in Italy, somewhere in Europe. They are trying to do this. They are trying to do this high frequency gravitational wave measurement using the old Weber bar technique. But because they don't want to associate with controversies. They've called it slightly different. Some acoustic wave detection, whatever. It's nice fun if you want to read about how people fight and how things are getting back into fashion in experimental detection. How people repurpose the same idea for better purposes, to be very clear. So then, another very successful attempt was an indirect detection, where in 1974, this is a PhD student, Hulse. Taylor was his supervisor, and they both got together and they spotted this binary neutron pulsar system, neutron star pulsar system. Any idea what a neutron star is, what a pulsar is? You should have asked before. I said neutron stars all the time. Huh? If anybody knows, please go ahead. Yeah. It's not a black hole.
Ma'am, is it a neutron star that is emitting jets from either side?
Yes, radio waves. Yes. A neutron star is, by the way, something that is a remnant of a huge star which has lost a lot of its mass, had a supernova, and become a very highly dense stellar system. Sorry. It's very difficult to spot these kinds of binary neutron pulsar systems because of a very specific reason. See, for formation of both the neutron star and the pulsar, both the stars should have had a supernova collision. And a supernova is a catastrophic event. If something happens to sun like it won't, because sun is not big enough to have a supernova, it will become a red giant and then collapse into a alpha star or whatever. In this case, if you assume that the sun is bigger and there was a supernova, anything close to it is not going to survive. And if there is a binary system of two big stars and one goes off into a super big supernova collision, then the probability of survival of the star, even still being there, not being pushed away or something happening to it, is very small. You want a certain specific size ratios between the stars for that to be possible. So, spotting binary neutron star pulsar systems or binary neutron star systems is really, really hard. And if you spot binary neutron star systems, you can't even spot it because you need something emitting from it to spot it. And two neutron stars are going to be too feeble to detect. So, you want a neutron star pulsar system, and it's really hard to detect. And one of the first things to be detected was in 1974 by Hulse Taylor. And why is this related to gravitational waves? Because both these systems are much heavier than the sun. And they are going around in really high speeds, about 10 power 5 meters per second, and in a tight orbit, like 10,000 kilometers, which is tight for stars. And because they are such huge systems going around in a tight orbit, they should generate gravitational waves. And because they are generating gravitational waves, they are going to lose energy. They are going to go and lose energy and kind of fall into each other progressively over 330 million years. But whatever, they are going to lose energy and their orbit size is going to reduce. If they reduce in a form which is predicted by Einstein and others, it's an indirect detection of gravitational waves. And they saw that the rate of decrease of orbital period was 76.5 microseconds per year. That's that tiny, and it was done very, very carefully. There's a very nice article written by Taylor along with Weisberg and Fowler in Scientific American. This is written in plain English, meant for school students. I would say that this is a wonderful read if you want to know more about this. So this was the first indirect evidence of gravitational waves. So what happened after that? Governments need some incentive to fund any big projects. This was the incentive which funded this project here, which is LIGO. So NSF, after the indirect evidence, they funded this project, And this built two interferometric devices, one in Hanford. This is the map of US, if you can see it. One in Hanford, the other in Livingston. And each arm is about 4 kilometers long. And there's a powerful laser which is about emits 20 watts of power into these two systems. This is something called a beam splitter. Do you know what is an interference? Great, lovely. So a beam splitter splits the light into two portions and it sends it along the two arms, goes back and forth in each arm for about 285 times. So travels around 1300 kilometers in each arm, then comes back to this beam splitter, and it is designed in such a way that the arms are, if they are at equal distance, they are maintained such that they are at equal distance. Then you would have a dark port here, which means there will be no light. It's a very, very sensitive equipment, which, I mean, there is noise control and all that, but if you for a minute switch off the noise control and walk say 500 meters away from it, it will detect it. It's that kind of sensitivity, and it will detect it as a huge thing. I mean, 500 meters away, it will detect a huge signal, and you must have just been walking. But they have serious noise control, and they have all kinds of thermal noise reduction. And this is their sensitivity curve. I don't know if you can see it. Is it clear enough? Yeah. They've said strain noise, right? When they say strain, what they mean is strain in the interferometer arm length. So a strain is a quantity which is obtained by change in arm length divided by the total interferometer arm length. So they can detect something as small as 10 power minus 21 in that strain. So this is state-of-the-art equipment that was built in two different locations and maintained in such a manner that the signals from those two can be synchronized. They have synchronized clocks going at each of these setups. There are separate research groups that work on just synchronizing the clocks in those two places. So it's that level of state-of-the-art techniques, and they use that to see changes. And what caused these changes in 2016? The change was caused by the collision of two black holes, and it merged together, and it formed a black hole which is about 62 solar masses. So it was that huge, and it lost 3 solar masses. So the individual systems put together was 65 solar masses big, and they came and crashed into each other and became one final black hole, and all the 3 solar masses was emitted as the mass was completely given off in gravitational radiation, which means it came out as gravitational waves. Imagine if that had only come in optical light, the entire universe would be blinded by it. It's that much light. It comes out with that kind of thing, and Allen, one of the scientists involved in the LIGO detection, said that it would have made an atomic bomb look like a spark. It's that level of energy. And again, this is a good read. Adrian Shaw's Science article. It talks about the researchers, their emotions at the time, things like that. It's fun. And if you want a serious reading on gravitational wave detectors, this is by the people who actually worked on the detector. Hartmut Groth is somebody who was involved both in the LIGO and the GEO collaborations, and he wrote this book along with Reeds and Solson. Both of them also worked in LIGO. So that's a good book. But it's a very advanced text. So you might need a lot more optics, a lot more quantum mechanics to understand what's going on. But yeah, if you want to challenge yourself, go ahead, try doing that. And then they detected this. This is what you heard, saw, and what Marco Dragos saw one evening in his computer and got very excited about. So what next? There are several ways in which they go over this. They use this to learn more about black hole mergers, neutron star mergers. It gives, there are some things called gamma ray bursts which happen along with neutron star mergers. There is a short train gamma ray burst, a long train gamma ray burst, what comes with what. They do all kinds of correlation studies, astronomical studies, which is what a gravitational observatory is about. These are observatories. This is another way in which you can measure, observe the universe. Just like X-rays opened up a new window to observe the universe, gravitational waves has opened up a new window to observe the universe. What I am trying to do in my research work is seeing how we can see quantum signatures of gravitational field from these kinds of experiments. In fact, we are trying to scale it down and make it lab scale. So this is more, as one of the scientists, Marcus Aspel-Mayer, remarked, pulled by imagination than pushed by experiments. So it's a long shot, we are trying it. So with this, I'll come to an end. What did we see? How distances are measured, flat versus curved spacetimes, what are gravitational waves, history and detection. You can get the slides here at this blogspot, RSIC 24 gravitational waves. It's not such a thing to remember. I mean, it's just the title with RSIC 24. This is a homework problem. It'll be there on the blogspot, so you don't need to copy. But yeah, please try it. In the blogspot, there'll be another slide following this which will give you a hint. So if you want to try it without the hint, don't go to the blogspot. Or don't go to the next slide. Thank you. If you have any questions, you can ask.
Thank you, ma'am, for taking time out of your day to spend time with us. And also thank you for condensing such massive amounts of information. It is something that us school students can understand. Thank you so much.